Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, Dr. Steve Mason returns to the channel. How you doing, Steve?
Very well. That's a really cool opening you have. I like that
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be with you, man.
Awesome. Let's get started. So the topic today is the life and the theology of Flavius Josephus. So I want to open us up with this question. How do you view Josephus's theology? Was he a typical first century AD Jew or atypical for his time? How do you look at his beliefs and compare and contrast them from others like him in his era?
Yeah, so some quick shots in answer to your question. First of all, I think the category of theology is already a problem for the first century. So it is in use, but it's got a very narrow meaning in the first century. So theologia, talking about gods. It's really restricted to how the language you use about gods. Josephus frames his outlook always in terms of philosophy. And this is like really broad. It covers everything from political philosophy, what is the polis, the state, city state, how should it be governed, what kind of government should you have, aristocracy, democracy, monarchy, how should you act, ethics, how should you think, how should you argue, the nature of the soul, is there a soul, is there an afterlife? All these questions for Josephus and for his contemporaries fall under the category of philosophy. And so right from the start, I mean, Jacob, in answer to your question, um, that's one thing, the category question. But then the second thing is, what's a typical Jew or Judean in the first century? It seems to me that the more we learn from individuals and small groups, the more diversity we see in their outlooks. And a third qualification is Josephus only rarely talks in a systematic way about his ideas or beliefs. And even then, it's in a very particular context and genre that he's doing it, in an argumentative essay against other people who have dissed Judean history. So we're not still getting a kind of comprehensive picture of his outlook, of his philosophy, only snippets of it. In his main writing, his two big histories, we're just getting his reflections on incidents, on events. So it can be pretty hard to extrapolate from that a theology or a coherent, comprehensive view of things. So against that background, that all explains, those three things, qualifications explain why I'd be reluctant to pronounce him like or unlike other Jews, Judeans of the first century. From there, I need to ask you if you have something more specific in mind that we can talk about.
Well, during the Jewish-Roman War, Josephus talks about an incident back when he was fighting for the rebels that that well, basically he was against the policy, the Judean policy of okay, other allies, other people can't fight along with us unless they were circumcised. Um, there's a passage that says something like that in Josephus, and I wanted to ask you what do you make of that? Does that represent his theology that Josephus thought circumcision was optional? It didn't have to be a requirement?
No, not at all. He believes, I mean, he talks a lot about circumcision as being, the distinctive hallmark of Judean males. I don't think he has any doubt about that. Let me read you the passage that you're talking about. This is not in his Judean war, when he talks about being a general over the Judean army. This is in his autobiography, where he's talking about the period before the Romans arrived. So this is when he's trying to, well, this is already another important qualification. I'm sorry. This is what you get for asking me on, Jacob. I have to make certain adjustments, qualifications. I know you don't mind, so I make them. In the autobiography, he describes his time in Galilee very differently from in his Judean war. In war, he's writing immediately after the events, after he goes to Rome, after Jerusalem has been destroyed. And he writes very soon after that event. And the whole idea of war is to defend the Jews against the slanders in Rome that they are a weak uh, nation who's just been defeated by Rome. Josephus undermines this picture at every point. And part of that is presenting himself as a great general who recruited an army of 100,000 Jews, and 60,000 of them passed his tough training boot camp. This is all, I think, most scholars agree, nonsense. But it's part of a whole picture in Rome. The autobiography, which has the passage you're talking about, is written 25 years later, and it presents his time in Galilee in a whole different light. It presents him going with two other priests, being sent by the Jerusalem authorities to persuade the people to lay down any arms that they have collected, to pacify them in case they're feeling very emotional about what's just happened in Jerusalem, and to just try to calm everything down and see what the Romans do after all when they return, because the Judeans in Jerusalem have massacred an auxiliary garrison of the Roman army, and also ambushed Cestius Gallus' legion on his way out. So they're expecting retribution of some kind. But the authorities, according to his autobiography, send him with two other priests to try to get everybody to calm down and not, be too emotional and act foolishly, and just wait and see what the Romans do. Anyway, it's in that context that he says this. Okay, he says in his Vita, his autobiography, section 112. Okay, I'm scrolling down because this is my translation here in the commentary. About this time, two dignitaries from the region of the Trachonitans, who were under the authority of King Agrippa II. So King Agrippa II has many territories that he rules that include not only Judean subjects, Jews, but many others. They came to me, supplying their own horses and weapons, and bringing along some money too. So these are people who apparently don't like being under King Agrippa II. And they see the turmoil going on in Galilee, and they cross over the lake or the river. They come in from Trachonitis, and they say, look, we'll join you. We've brought our own horses, our own weapons, and we'd like to contribute some money because these are rich guys. The Judeans kept pressuring these men to be circumcised if they wished to live among them. So that Josephus says, my fellow Jews here were saying, hey, if you want to be with us and work with us, you've got to convert. You've got to become Judeans. You've got to undergo circumcision. But I would not allow them to be forced, declaring, quote, each person must revere God in keeping with his own chosen way, but not by force. And these men who are fleeing to us, expecting safety or security, so they're fleeing, they're coming as refugees to us. Excuse me, I got to go down through the commentary to the next page. Ought not to have second thoughts. They ought not to regret coming to live among us because we're going to force them to be circumcised. When the mob had been persuaded, I generously provided the men who had come with all the amenities for their familiar way of life. So the passage is about, well, first of all, it's not clear this is even for fighting the Romans in this passage. These guys lived in King Agrippa's territory, and Agrippa is allied with the Romans, and so they come and want to join the Judeans. Some Judeans are saying, hey, you've got to be circumcised if you're going to be fighting among us. So apparently there weren't that many foreigners fighting among them. Josephus says, no, look, they've come to live with us for security. They can follow their own customs. We're not going to force them to follow ours. If they wanted to, that would be fine. But if they're our guests, so we're going to treat them, let them live their own life. Do you see what I mean? So I don't think that says anything about Josephus's view of circumcision. If people want to become Judeans, yeah, males should be circumcised for him. That's clear. That's clear from other passages in his works.
We have a super chat question from Neophyte1. Thank you for your super chat. He says, hope this isn't too far off topic, Doctor, but do we know anything about the publication and spread of Josephus's works that may indicate where and when the author of Luke could have had access to them?
Yes, we do. Thank you. It's quite a good question. Jacob, I'll leave it to you to tell me first whether you want to go in this direction or you want to stay with the others for the moment and come back to the question, or it's up to you. You're the host.
Well, you can go ahead and answer this question, then we'll get back to the original topic.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, what we know, we don't know for sure very much in the ancient past, of course, but what looks probable, because Josephus wrote it while Vespasian and Titus were still alive, and he gave copies of his books to them, so it would be hazardous for him to write this were it not true. He says that his Judean War, his first work, he presented a copy to Vespasian and a copy to Titus and to all the other generals who had fought in the war on both sides, Judeans and Romans, once it was over, and that Titus declared this work to be this should be like the official history of the war, or not the official history of the war. It's not a Roman history, it's a Judean history, but the kind of the best history of the war. This is the go-to text if you want to find out what happened, which is strange because the work actually undermines the Flavian propaganda at very many points. But anyway, maybe you didn't read it. But he authorized it to be deposited in the library. So the way ancient publication works, of course, there's no printing press. There's no way of mass dissemination of works. The only way you can really copy a work is by hand. Somebody has to actually copy the thing out. So when you've got a work of, 130,000 words, the Judean War, 127,000 words, that's a lot of copying. So this is usually done by slaves, like educated Greek educated slaves would be sent from a rich person's house to a library. So the library is a place with all kinds of like pigeonholes with scrolls in them, and a slave would be permitted to sit there and copy it out, or possibly take it home and copy it out, and then return the master copy. Right. So that's how the work gets disseminated. And Josephus claims that when he gave copies to Titus and Vespasian, Titus authorized his to be deposited in the imperial library so that people could then come and copy it. So it became known that way. It also became known by recitation. And this was another way of kind of partial dissemination. An author would hold meetings like a lecture hall and would read out sections. Now, we would think today that's an awfully long work to be read out, but we know that it happened, and it wasn't done in one sitting. It might be done in, like an audio book. You listen to it, over many hours, 10, 20, 25 hours, over, a few weeks. So there would be recitation sessions like that. We know about this from Pliny's, the younger Pliny's letters, and from Tacitus. And from Lucian, as we know that this kind of stuff happened. This was the literary culture of Rome. And Josephus, interestingly, claims in the introduction to his war that he has heard other historians' accounts, and it's like in present tense. He's hearing them. He's hearing their work, and it seems that others have already heard him recite his work because they criticize his Greek. So it's a very lively literary culture that is partly oral and then partly depositing books, entire books for copying. So that's the beginning of it, and we know that much. And then what we know is that people who have been exposed to his work in some way, probably by hearing it, request him to write the Antiquities. Because he says at the beginning of Antiquities, there's this group of guys who have been pressuring me for many years to get this finished. And he names them. So it seems like they're an actual group in Rome. I hope that answers the question in a basic way.
We actually have another super chat. John Matcher, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on Josephus being Paul? I'll ask Ralph Ellis.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, Steve?
Yeah. I'm sorry. I wish Ralph Ellis well. I know that he's very popular, and I don't want to say anything that will sound too dismissive. Our methods are just completely different. That's really all I can say. They don't intersect in any way. In my view, conclusions are not very important in history. It's how you get to the conclusions. It's a little bit like, in high school when you do your math homework. You might get a mark for getting the conclusion right, but the teacher wants to see how you got to the conclusion, right? Because you might just have guessed. In ancient history, there's a kind of parallel. It's how you get to the conclusions that matters, because we often change our conclusions, right, with new evidence and new ways of looking at things. So, almost anything's conceivable, but there are so many views out there that I think just don't work. They don't. For me, in my life, so my job every day is to be studying these texts one by one, and like take First Thessalonians, the first letter that Paul wrote. How could this have been Josephus? I'm not saying. So what I'm trying to say is I don't want to dismiss Ralph Ellis's views or anybody else's, Valiant's on the Flavian creation of Christianity or anything like that, on the basis of their conclusions. It's not like I'm saying, oh, that can't be the case. I hate that conclusion. It's not like that. It's that it doesn't have any explanatory power for me in my work. So that's all I really want to say about it, is we're working in completely different modes of analysis. Okay.
How do you think Josephus's outlook on Judaism has changed from before the war to during the war to after the war?
You're really going to get annoyed at me, Jacob, for this. I think you seem a very patient and calm person, but I have a suspicion if I keep making qualifications on basic terminology, you will get fed up with me. But I have to do it because Judaism, the term that you're asking about, so Josephus' views on Judaism before the war, during the war, after the war, I have to say I don't think he had a view on Judaism, because Judaism is a creation of the early Christians. I think this is clear. I've written some stuff about this, but the word just doesn't appear until the rise of Christianity. And Christians talk a lot about, they use the Greek word Judaismos, or the Latin term Judaismus, by which they mean a system of belief and practice, namely the observance of Moses' laws. Christians call that Judaism. And the reason they call it Judaism is they want to contrast it with Christianism, which is their creation, right? So they create all these other isms as opposites to Christianism, which they think is the truth. All right, so they believe in Christ and in salvation through Christ, and then they look at so there's you can read Eusebius on this. He says, let's call that whole system of following those kind of barren laws of Moses, let's call that Judaism. And let's call Hellenism the worship of these dumb idols, right? So now we've got Christianism over against Hellenism and Judaism. Which one's the best? Christianism. Well, it seems to me that scholars, historians ought not to be invested in Christian language like that. And yet it's stuck, it's stuck. Of course, it's been taken over in Jewish circles forever since the ancient world. So I'm not criticizing that. What I'm saying is it's very hard to talk about Josephus's view of Judaism because he never uses the word. So here's my point. In the ancient world, you have peoples, like you have the Romans, you have the Syrians, you have the Egyptians, and the Judeans, and each people has its own laws, its own customs, its own ways of doing things, its own worship, its own God, its own sacrifices, sacrificial system, its own way, its own diet, its ways, its calendar, its festivals, its holidays. These differ from one polis to another. Each people has its own customs, its own ancestral ways of doing things. None of them has an ism. Like we don't talk about Syriaism, like Syrism or Romism. If you said that to somebody, like if I said to you, Jacob, well, how did Tacitus's views of Romism change from when he wrote the Agricola to when he wrote the histories, or from before he was a senator? Well, how did his views of Romism change? You'd look at me like I was crazy. And I'm not criticizing you for asking the question. That's a perfectly normal question. Scholarship still, virtually all scholarship still uses the term Judaism. That's fine. I mean, if somebody asks me what I teach, often I'll say, ancient Judaism. That's fine as a kind of preliminary means of communication. But if we're actually asking about something specific in the ancient world, it doesn't really work. Because there was no such ism, just like there's no, Americanism, or Canadaism, or Englishism today in the sense of a comprehensive system of, life and practice. Do you see what I mean? So the reason that's important is Josephus's views. I don't think we have any evidence of his views changing because we don't have a diary or anything like that from him. We just have his histories, and his histories look, broadly coherent. He changes his description of certain events from the earlier period to the later period. That doesn't mean his views changed necessarily, or his what you called his theology at the beginning, his philosophy. It doesn't mean that changed. It just means he's writing different works and using events in a different way for those different works. I can give you an example of that might help to address your question, but I'm going to stop talking now in case I'm off on the wrong train track here.
Well, you can go ahead and provide the example if you wish.
Okay. So here's a couple of examples of how people sometimes say his views have changed. Okay. And that may help to get at the issues. So in the war, he presents King Herod, especially King Herod and Herod's father, Antipater, as kind of heroic figures. So remember that the war has a purpose. He's writing the war to discount the common Flavian views of the Judeans. So the Flavians claim in their propaganda after the triumph, they claim they were the first to conquer Judea and Jerusalem. In fact, there was an inscription on the lost Arch of Titus, but the inscription was preserved by a medieval copyist that said, This arch is because Titus did what nobody had either they'd not tried it before or they'd not succeeded in subduing this people, the Judeans. Well, it's a load of hogwash, right? Lots of people had conquered Jerusalem before: the Babylonians, the Persians, the Seleucids, and then the Romans came, and the Romans had conquered it 130 years before the Flavians did. So this is total nonsense. Josephus is writing the war to undermine all of that. Now, in that account, he presents Antipater and King Herod in a very positive way. So Herod really mainly appears as a quite a heroic figure, a very capable king, very tough, very courageous, very pious. I mean, he honors God. He rebuilds the temple, and makes it magnificent. He comes across as a real stand-up guy in the war, and the part of the reason for that is to show that he was already Josephus claims he was the closest friend of the Emperor Augustus. Maybe not true, but he was a good friend of the Emperor Augustus, who appointed him as king. And then his son Archelaus, Augustus put in power after that. So he was committed to the Herodian family. This completely undermines the Flavian claim that they were the big shots, who conquered Judea. This is old stuff. Already King Herod, who was a great king. Everybody's heard of our King Herod. So that's how Josephus plays it in the war, because of the aims he has in war. In Antiquities, later on, so you asked about a change of views. In Antiquities, he portrays King Herod, same guy, in much darker hues. Why? Well, because the later work has a different purpose altogether. It's trying to show the power, the efficacy of Judean law, the laws of Moses, which Josephus claims reflect the laws of nature. And he says at the beginning of Antiquities, I want to show you that everybody who follows the laws prospers and succeeds in everything they do, whereas those who don't follow the laws meet calamity and disaster and a disastrous end. Well, in this version, his whole Antiquities is a series of life stories of different people to show how they did good and how they did bad. So even beginning with the biblical kings, right? He shows that some of them were good and they prospered. Some of them were bad and they didn't. Some of them were partly good. They did good things like Saul and David. But then they also offended God and they met disaster. When it comes to King Herod in the Antiquities, he treats him differently from in war. He still says he was courageous and kind of pious, but he makes no bones about the fact that he was a tyrant who was out for power, and he met a bitter end. He had a terrible death, and all of his descendants, he says at one point, have all gone now a century later, which was not the emphasis at all in the war. But then the question is, I mean, some people used to say, especially in older decades, they said, so you can see he's changed his views a lot. And the common idea was that war was somehow a Roman propaganda, and that Josephus changed his outlook and became a more enthusiastic devotee of Moses' laws and closely associated with his own people in the Antiquities. I think this is not possible. First, it rests on a very weak reading of the war. There's no basis for this idea that it's Roman propaganda. It's quite the opposite. It's anti-Roman propaganda. He says that plainly many times from the prologue onward. So I think people just weren't reading the text very carefully in olden days, and they were looking for other things in the text. They weren't reading it as a whole composition. They were just pulling out bits and pieces and putting it together in a different frame. So anyway, that's all to say that I don't see the evidence for a change of outlook on Josephus's part. I see him doing very different things. in the war and in the antiquities, but there are also many lines of continuity between them. Does that help?
Oh, I thought that was a really good answer. I'm gonna take a look at the next super chat. Let's see what we got here. Neophyte One, thank you for your super chat again. He says Josephus speaks of the Jews as being the most unified people, yet also mentions numerous heresies amongst them. How did he understand religious unity?
That's a really good question too. So what you're thinking, Neophyte One, I think you're thinking of the Against Appian, his final work, in which he's talking about. I mean, we call it Against Appian. That's a misnomer. It's not all about Appian by any means. Only 1/4 of it is devoted to Appian. It's really its proper title is On the Antiquity of the Jews. So this is an essay, unlike his other works, which are histories, which are narratives, right? This is an argumentative essay and very enjoyable, very highly polemical, full of wit and humor and devastating polemic against the detractors of the Judeans. So what he's trying to say there is that, first of all, that the Judean ancient texts, the Bible, essentially, are unified. Now, modern scholars, of course, who study the Bible, say not so much. They identify different and somewhat contradictory strains within the biblical text. JEDP for the Pentateuch and all of that, and different editions of JEDP, and seeing that the priestly text and the Elohistic text as having, Yahwistic text having different kind of outlook and all that. Josephus didn't know any of that. Scholars long ago pointed out that Deuteronomy doesn't agree with Exodus on the Decalogue. Josephus didn't know any of that about modern scholarship. He simply viewed as a practicing priest in the temple and a practicing Jew. He saw this as wonderfully unified. We have a unified system of laws from Moses, right? And his point was to contrast that with the Greek world. That's why he's writing, because the Greeks, in his view, have been attacking Greeks and Egyptians, particularly in Alexandria, who are kind of Greco-Egyptians, have been attacking, slandering the Jews as if they were some kind of recent offshoot of the Egyptians, right? And his whole attack is to say, look, you guys, first, you're born yesterday, you didn't even learn the alphabet until, recent centuries. Your texts, the things you pride yourselves on, like Homer's epics, and then the histories that you've written, Thucydides and Herodotus. This is how he opens the Appian. He says, these things are all wrong, filled with falsehoods. Every scholar knows that, he says. He's very up on the criticism of Homer and Thucydides and Herodotus. And he says, yeah, they're full of contradictions and they're recent. And that's because history is an effort to investigate the past. That's what you guys do. And that's the best you can do, right? You've got traditions, human traditions, and they're full of silliness, like Homer's epics are full of ridiculous ideas about the gods. And then you've got Thucydides and Herodotus and their successors. He says, we Judeans don't need all that. Our books, which are 22 in number, and they're perfectly unified, and we didn't learn them by historical investigation. They are not the products of human investigation. They came from prophets. Prophets told us, beginning with Moses, the first and biggest prophet, he didn't know, he wasn't present at creation, but God spoke through him and told him what was going on. So this is a long answer to your question, Neophyte One, I realize. But it's important to understand why he's saying what he's saying there in the Appian. So he's saying our text and our way of life is given by God, which reflects the laws of nature, and therefore it's all one. And it was just given to us as truth through prophets. So we didn't have to investigate it, and that's why it's not filled with errors and contradictions. And therefore, we have a unified people under the priests, under the high priest, under God. So there's God, there's the high priest, there's the whole priestly college, and they administer our lives, teaching us the laws, supervising the laws, interpreting the laws for us. And that's our ideal system. And he says a few times, he kind of breaks into exultant language in the last part of Against Appian. What could be a finer system of government than this? Our laws are the best. They predate Pythagoras and Plato. He says this. I mean, he actually names Pythagoras and Plato, and he says they borrowed from Moses, right? They stole their best ideas from us. But then they kind of screwed them all up, and the Greeks have gone in all these contrary and divisive ways. We have this simple, unified system of law that is more ancient, more perfect than anybody else. So that's the context in which he's talking about the unity of the Judeans. But this is on a fairly, abstract level of political theory in a way. In the other works you're referring to, where he talks about the different groups among the Judeans, he doesn't call them heresies. He does use the Greek word that would become the word for heresy in Christian usage, heresis. That's the Greek term. It is the word that would become heresy or faction, namely somebody who deviates from the truth, the norm. It would become that in Christian usage later. But at this time, in Greek usage, heresis was a common term for a philosophical school. And Josephus is claiming that the Judeans, so just like the Greeks have different philosophical schools among them, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Platonists, so he says that the Judeans, being an ancient civilization, and being rich and broad, have three ancestral schools of philosophy, and they mirror the Greek schools in that they disagree on issues of fate and free will and on the soul. So that he says, the Essenes attribute everything to fate, and the Sadducees say there's no fate, and the Pharisees kind of bring up the middle position. Some things are due to fate, some things not. These are very crude sketches. He's not saying these are heresies. He's saying these are esteemed ancient schools of philosophy among us that one can study. In his autobiography, he even says, "I studied. I wanted to learn the best school, so I studied with each of them: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes." Just like his Greek counterparts would go and study with the Stoics, they'd study with Platonists, the Epicureans, maybe a couple of others, before they entered public life and became serious about, finding their place in society. As a young person, they would experiment. And he says that's exactly what he did. So he's not trashing these schools. He's not saying they were heresies by any means. He's saying, this part of our culture, we have these, we are a rich enough, broad enough culture. That's another reason not to use the term Judaism, which he doesn't use. Philo doesn't use. Nobody uses it in the ancient world before Christianity. There's one exception, but I won't get into that unless you want me to. Anyhow, so I don't think there's a contradiction there. He's not saying in one place we're all unified, we all get along well, we don't have any problems, and in another place, we have all these heresies. It's not like that. It's in the one work he's talking at the level of political philosophy. That's the Against Appian. In his other works, his histories, he's talking about actual problems that people had with each other in real life. And the problems were not with the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. They're part of the culture. The problems were with deviant men who didn't follow the laws of God. Judeans, who were militants, power seekers, tyrants. They got carried away with their own, ambitions over against God's laws. for Josephus, those are the people who are the problem. I hope that helps.
Well, it looks like we're going to go off topic for a moment with this next question from Renzo Rodriguez. Thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on Jesus equals the Egyptian?
Yeah. Lorenzo, thank you for the question. This is in the same, my answer has to be the same, I'm afraid. It will be the same for, Paul as Josephus, for the Flavian invention of Christianity. It's not the conclusion that's a problem. It just doesn't explain anything. The Egyptian is a figure that Josephus mentions incidentally once in War II and once in Antiquities 20. That's it. I mean, he just mentions him among many, 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 many other people of the time. And Luke Acts, in my view, influenced by Josephus, also mentions him because the guy had a name, right? Like his parents didn't call him the Egyptian. He had a name of some kind. In Josephus's context, it's enough for him to call him the Egyptian pseudo prophet. That is, there's lots of false prophets around. There was an Egyptian guy who was one. He came in from Egypt. He was Jewish. He's probably from Alexandria or one of the Greek cities. So he comes to Jerusalem. He's Jewish, but he became what Josephus labels a pseudo prophet, a false prophet. There's absolutely no reason to think this was Jesus, in my view. But again, it's not the conclusion that matters. What you have here, I think, is a method that the people have come up with these ideas are just not doing the work that I do, and I'm not doing the work that they do. I'm a professor of history, of ancient history, and I have to sit down and make sense of evidence and texts. So this works differently. So what many people who don't have to work in my field do, and they do other jobs. Some of them are lawyers, trained lawyers, doctors, business people, professionals of various kinds, and I don't begrudge them their views. Okay, I'm not attacking their views, but basically, from what I've seen of what they do, their method is like this: they see something here and they see something there, and they say, "Oh wow, look at that! I see a parallel." And so they begin from a hypothesis. They begin from an idea, and they say, "Let's see how that works." And for them, once they've got the idea, they can project it onto the rest of the material. That's not how my work functions. For the historian, you begin with a problem, right? What you're investigating problems. What is the problem? So my question would be, what problem does that hypothesis solve? It doesn't solve a problem. There's no problem. I mean, there's no problem that is solved by making Jesus the Egyptian, in my view. But that's because I have a conception of the evidence that will be different from other people's. So I don't begrudge them their views if they want to, if that makes sense to them. Fine. It's not the conclusion that I don't like. It's just that it doesn't help me at all. It doesn't help me understand anything. It doesn't help me understand Jesus or the Gospels or the Egyptian references in Josephus. There's nothing that it explains for me. But if other people like the idea, more power to them. I'm not here to try to tell people what they should think.
Let's take a look at the next one. Christian Michael, thank you for your super chat. What do you make of the attribution of knowledge of Jesus, specifically of prophethood, and a Jewish plot against Jesus being attributed to Josephus in Contra Celsum 147, Book 18, is mentioned in chapter 47?
What do you make? So, Christian, you're asking, what do you make of the attribution of knowledge of Jesus, specifically of prophethood, and a Jewish plot against Jesus being attributed to Josephus in Contra Celsum 147. Book 18 is mentioned in chapter 47. Okay. I'm not completely clear about what you mean by this, but I'm going to take a stab at it. If you could please feel free, if Jacob will allow you to follow up to clarify. If I go wrong, please just let me know. So what I'm thinking you're talking about is, Origen wrote this against Celsus in the 3rd century, and he is responding to the work of the philosopher Celsus from 160s, 170s, whose works are otherwise lost to us, but Origen writes this massive response to him and quotes him extensively. So in book 1 of the Contra Celsum, I guess this is talking about a Jewish opposition to Jesus. And I think by book 18, you mean the passage on Jesus. No, you can't mean that. In Antiquities, you can't mean Antiquities 18. So I'm a bit confused about what you mean. I mean, I do have the Contra Celsum here. I can look it up. If you want to go on, Jacob, I can actually pull up the passage that the person is talking about.
Sure.
Okay, so for some reason, I have the text. For some reason, it's not opening on my computer. It says the file is corrupted. That's weird. Because I've used it many times. Although I'm on my laptop here, and it could be, I suspect it's stored in Dropbox, but I suspect that it's been that there's some problem in connection. Rather than the file being corrupted. Anyway, so I don't know, or I can do a quick search for it online.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Do you want to move on and we come back to this, because it may take a minute to pull it up?
That's okay. You can look it up real quick.
Okay, I've got it open here. This is the old Schaff version, okay, which is in the public domain. That's why it's okay. So 47. All right. So he's responding. We've answered the objection. If Jesus really wished to manifest his divine power, he ought to have shown himself to those who ill-treated him and to the judge who condemned him. There was, however, no obligation on him to appear either to the judge who condemned him. Origen responds, for Jesus spared both the one and the other, that they might not be smitten with blindness as the men of Sodom were. Okay, I won't read the whole thing. Jesus wished to show his power was divine. I don't suppose he guarded. And it is in vain for Celsus to add, he had no longer occasion to fear any man after his death, being, as you say, a god. I don't see anything here. And sorry. I'm misreading the numbers. Here's 47. It's very short. Celsus represents, moreover, a statement of his own, Celsus, as if it were an answer to one of his questions, in which he asked, by what train of argument are you led to regard him as the Son of God? For he makes us answer that we were won over to him because we knew that his punishment was undergone to bring about the destruction of the father of evil, Satan. Now, we were won over to his doctrine by innumerable other considerations, and we'll continue to enumerate them, not only while dealing with the so-called true discourse of Celsus, and as if we said that we consider him to be the Son of God because he suffered punishment, he asks, what then? Have not many others too been punished? And that not less disgraceful? Here Celsus acts like the most contemptible enemies of the gospel. This is 47. This is 147, but it doesn't say anything about. Here Celsus acts like the most contemptible enemies of the gospel, like those who imagine it follows as a consequence from our history that we should worship those who have undergone crucifixion. So Origen's having a good time responding to Celsus here, making fun of him. I don't see. This is 147, I believe. It's 47 anyway. I think it's 1. So yeah, I don't. Oh. I'm sorry. I seem to be wasting your time here. It's actually
all right.
that was 247. I just went to the 47 that looked closest to the top of the thing, but there's actually one before that, 47. Okay, we're finally there. I would like to say to Celsus, who represents the Jew, yeah, so this is where Celsus brings in a Jew to criticize Christianity, as accepting John the Baptist, who baptized Jesus, that the existence of the Baptist is related by one who lived no great length of time. This is Josephus. Okay, so yes, the 18th book, but this is not about the so-called Testimonium Flavianum. That's what I couldn't figure out. This is about John the Baptist. In the 18th book of his Antiquities, Josephus bears witness to John as having been a Baptist and as promising purification to those who underwent the rite. This writer, although not believing in Jesus, in seeking the cause of the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. Yeah. It's a famous passage. I didn't know it was 147, but yeah. Paul, a genuine disciple of Jesus, says that he regarded this James as a brother of the Lord, not so much on account of blood relationship, but they're being brought up together. So what he said in the middle part there is, this one of the famous passages in Origen where he says that the destruction of the temple was, according to Josephus, because of the Jewish treatment of James. And here he's also referring to Antiquities 20:200, where the high priest Ananus executes James, the brother of Jesus. And then Origen goes on to explain, this is also James, the brother of Jesus, also referred to by Paul. I don't know what the issue there is exactly. That doesn't help me with the question about a Josephus plot. Josephus being involved in a plot to kill Jesus. I think that was the original question.
Let me put it back up. What he's saying is that Origen is claiming in Contra Celsum that the story of the prophethood of Jesus and the Jewish plot against Jesus came out from Josephus's text, originated from Josephus.
No. I mean, I don't understand, because this is an offhand reference. So he's combining two things here. One is the Antiquities 18 passage on John the Baptist. So Origen is criticizing Celsus all the way through. He's saying Celsus has this character called that he brings in to criticize Christianity, who's a Jew, and he says the Jew accepts John somehow as a Baptist, and we know Origen says he's the guy who baptized Jesus. That's not in Josephus. That the existence of John the Baptist baptizing for the remission of sins is related by one who lived no great length of time after John and Jesus, that is, Josephus. For in the 18th book of his Antiquities, Josephus bears witness to John as having been a Baptist. Now this writer, Josephus, though not believing in Jesus, in seeking the cause of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, says it was due to the treatment of James. So we can now forget about Antiquities 18, I think. That's not relevant here. His main point is about Antiquities 20, 200, 197 to 203 or so. He's talking there about Ananus, a Sadducean high priest, and he's relating each of the high priests. And he wants to say in that part of Antiquities, remember I said that Antiquities is all about the thesis that those who follow the laws prosper and succeed. Those who violate the laws meet calamity and disaster in everything they do. So here he's talking about Ananus II, who in war, again, was actually one of the good guys. And he describes his death in war 4. But in Antiquities 20, again, just like with Herod, I said he switched his portrayal around. He says, well, he was a Sadducee, this chief priest, this high priest. When he became high priest, he had enemies, and he dealt with them in violation of the laws. So he took advantage of the death of Festus, the governor. So the Roman governor should be around to be involved in capital trials. But he died in office, and his replacement, Albinus, had not yet arrived. It would take some months, some weeks at least, for him to arrive from Rome. So Ananus took advantage of this absence of the governor to get rid of a bunch of his enemies. He just had them executed. And among the people, there were several of them, there were a bunch of them, but among them was a guy named Jacob. By the way, he's the brother of the Jesus I mentioned before, the one known as the Christ. Now, Josephus does not say that the fall of the temple was because of the death of James. That's Origen's fiddling with the text. But he's taking something Josephus does say and stretching it. What Josephus does say is that this malfeasance of these high priests, several of them, and he talks about other bad things they did, like, for example, the richer priests sending out goons to beat up on the poorer priests, and also some priests stealing the tithes and the food even of others. So this bad stuff. And he does say that at the end of all that, this was what led to the destruction of the temple. But he does not single out Ananus' execution of all his enemies, including this Jacob or James. He doesn't single that out. But Origen, looking at the text, says, he did. He made the destruction of the temple a consequence of Ananus' killing of James, the brother of Jesus. So he says it's too bad he didn't also believe Jesus was the Messiah. So this is Origen, right? It's not Celsus, it's Origen fiddling a little bit with Josephus' text in the way that Christian writers generally did. So I'm terribly sorry, but I don't see the content of the question in Contra Celsum 147.
Well, let's get to the next one. Neophyte 1, thank you for the super chat. Forgive me, doctor. You may disregard this question if too off topic, but if I may ask, do you think it likely all gospel authors knew Josephus's works?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's no more off topic than the Luke Acts Josephus question. So if Jacob's okay with me taking these, then I don't mind answering it. Again, it's not about conclusions. Some people get very exercised about these issues. I've had people write to me, not scholars, but just people out of the blue saying, why don't you think Josephus knew that Mark knew Josephus? Or you say Luke Acts knew Josephus, but you don't think Mark did. Why? Like, that's inconsistent. Um, and I don't know why people get worked up about these things, or why. I mean, let's put it another way: why people are invested in these ideas. I really don't. For a historian, you can't be invested in conclusions, as I tried to say before, because conclusions come and go. We change our minds, just like scientists do, with new evidence, with new ways of understanding the evidence. You can't do history. You cannot. This is a really important point, because so many people are propagating ideas or propositions or theses or hypotheses. You cannot do history if you are wedded to a conclusion. You cannot do history if you already know the conclusion and you're invested in it. It's impossible, because obviously you can't investigate in an open-minded way if you already have a hypothesis that you're committed to, right? And that's why believers of any kind, that means, Christian believers, if they believe that certain historical things happened in a certain way, cannot really do history. But it holds the same for people who are on the other end, who are atheists, agnostics, and really committed to certain historical propositions. It's fine if they're committed to them. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with Christian believers believing that certain things happen. But I'm a historian, and that's the problem. You cannot do history. In the same way, you cannot do good science if you're already committed to, say this drug will have this. I'm sure this drug will have this reaction. I don't care what the evidence is. You can't do an honest investigation if you already believe certain things. In the same way, so it's just a question of explaining evidence. To come back to this question here, it's just a matter of, what is the problem and how do you solve the problem? In the case of Luke Acts, we call it, there's a clear problem that has been recognized ever since the beginning of critical scholarship. And it is that crucial events in Josephus, the census under Quirinius, the rebellion of Judas the Galilean, the rise of the Sicarii, whom otherwise only Josephus talks about, this Latin named group of knife-carrying assassins, the Egyptian pseudo-prophet, the calling the Pharisees and Sadducees haireses, coming back to an earlier question, using the word haireses and claiming that the Pharisees were the most precise of the schools. So akribestate, akribea is the root. All of this Greek language, and even the Lysanias as the Tetrarch of Abilene in Luke chapter 3, who goes nowhere in the text, but Luke mentions this Lysanias tetrarching over Abilene. These things all appear in Josephus and in Luke Acts. So the problem has always been, it's a well-known problem, it's been debated since the 19th century. How did they come to have the same stuff in like this? In my solution to the problem is I argue not from that the data are similar, but that the actual formulations, the linguistic formulations, are Josephine. So I think it likely that Luke Acts used Josephus because Josephus's distinctive language has left its traces in Luke Acts. Okay, that's not the case for Matthew, John, or Mark. It's simply not the case, and there's no problem there that would be solved by arguing that Mark knew Josephus. That doesn't mean I can prove that Mark didn't know Josephus. It doesn't mean I can prove that Matthew or John didn't know Josephus. I simply have no reason to think they did. I don't know any problem that would be solved by that hypothesis. Okay? Is that clear, Jacob? Do you think?
Yes, I think that was really good. I think it makes a lot of sense. Let's get to the next one. Graham Pong, thank you for your super chat. I think this question actually might be back on topic. Josephus writing to Jewish families across empire.
This has to do, again, it's the conclusion isn't something I care to debate. Josephus could have done anything. He could have, you know, he might have had friends in Gaul, France. I don't know. He might have written letters to them. He might have had a nephew in Spain and written to him. So it's not about conclusions. It's about what problem are we solving? What are we doing? What question are we asking? To which this would be the answer. What we can be pretty sure of, because we have evidence for it, is that Josephus published his works. That is, he made them public, not in the way we publish works. You know, when I write books, I sit usually in my study or in the library, mostly in my study because I have my own library mostly for what I need, and I type away, imagining my audience. Right, usually scholars in Israel and Australia and Japan and the U.S. and Canada and Europe. How do I reach that audience? It's not my problem today, because what I do is I write a manuscript, and once it goes through all the proper vetting and maybe rejection or whatever, but if a publisher finally agrees to publish it, the publisher has the job of finding my target audience. I'm done. When I hand them the manuscript, so to speak, I email it to them, then it's theirs. And they have the job of marketing. They have the job of producing printed and digital copies to reach my audience. So they do this in a very skillful way. They find out, well, who's the intended audience? Well, they would probably go to these conferences and they would probably read these journals. So we'll place ads in these journals and we will have a book display at these conferences advertising your book, and we will get your book to your audience. Yeah, you have to remember that in the ancient world, there was absolutely none of this. So you can't think of publication in anything like modern ways, right? Not at all. So the ways that people publish, that is, the word publish actually means to make public their work, was not through publishers. It was through an author reciting parts of their text to a local audience. So here's the thing. There are a number of books and articles written on this subject if people are interested. Yeah, I mean, really quite a few. Just look up ancient publication, the publication of ancient texts. Excellent article, summary article by Chester Starr on this subject, among many others. There's an excellent book in French as well, Reading in Rome, it's called, Lire à Rome. How do you read in Rome? And what these studies do is they bring together ancient evidence from everywhere, from Pliny to Galen to all sorts of authors, and it shows that the way that you reach your public, primarily in the first instance, is through reading. First of all, maybe to a few friends at dinner, then you expand and expand and expand. Pliny describes this process of sort of expanding your audience until you include critics, until you include people who are not necessarily thrilled with what you're saying, but they're going to sit there and listen to what you're saying and then tell you all the things that are wrong with it later. Lucian in his work, How to Write History, talks about visiting and listening to people reciting history. And then he gets up and walks out when he's fed up. No, I hated that introduction. I hated that description. And he just storms out. And he writes a whole essay about this. So we know it happened. That's one way, reciting to your audiences. The other way, as I said, is when you're finished with the work, when you've done this, when you've taken criticism, when you're pretty happy with what you've got, you make a final copy and then have slaves make a few presentation copies for others, and then it gets deposited somewhere. Some ancient authors would not agree to this at all. They like Virgil wanted all of his works destroyed as soon as he died, right? And Augustus didn't allow it, and his works were preserved, thank heaven. So we still have Virgil's writings. But also Galen, the great physician, was worried about his books getting on beyond his circle. So this is a totally different way of thinking in the ancient world. You reach your audience, your main audience, under your control. You don't leave it to a publisher, right? It's the people in your location. So now, finally, to come back to the question, therefore, um, could Josephus have written to families, Jewish families across the empire? Yeah, he could have done, but uh, but how? I mean, a book like The War is 7 rolls, right? 7 rolls of text with no breaks between words, 7 scrolls. Was he having copies of 7 scrolls just for the war, 20 scrolls for the antiquities, right? Bundled together and sent off to families across the empire? Maybe. I can't prove that he wasn't, but I don't know any reason to think that he was, is my answer.
Let's take a look at the next one. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. How would I start to research the North American slave trade? Thomas Sowell has a book that is shocking about stuff I had no clue about. And there's a lot of facts because of political correctness not being taught in schools.
As it happens, I've read some of Thomas Sowell's books, and I would say the best thing to do, I suppose, if you're interested, is keep reading Thomas Sowell and some of the people he refers to. You'll understand this is not my area at all. I'm a historian of the Roman Empire and ancient Judea, not the North American slave trade. So I really can't make any competent suggestions beyond what you're already suggesting. Look at the bibliography in Thomas Sowell's work or the footnotes, and look up other, do internet searches as beginning places to find information about the North American slave trade. The American Historical Association, which I don't belong to because I'm not an American historian, but I'm a historian, so I do see some of their discussions and debates. These are live issues in today, now, just the past couple of weeks in the American Historical Association. So by all means, look up, their website, their discussions, and see what people are saying about these things.
Let's take a look at the next one. Renzo Rodriguez, thank you for your super chat. Why was Josephus ignored by most but Christians?
I take this to mean by most people except Christians.
Yeah, that's how it reads to me.
Yeah. So I that's what I thought, or it could be a typo for ignored by most. Yeah. Oh no, I think it must be by most people except Christians, right? Okay, let's say that's what it means. I don't think he was. We have to be careful in ancient history about what evidence has survived. We must not think that the ancient world was well represented by what has reached us. Here's a stunning, sobering fact, which is the beginning of all historical understanding. Almost everything has disappeared from 2,000 years ago. Almost everything. We know very, very little. So the question isn't the question to ask is why what has survived has survived. So in the case of Josephus's works, you're right. What's implicit in your question that his works were later preserved by Christians. That's from the 3rd and 4th centuries onward. His works were, as were Philo's works, Philo of Alexandria, they were copied mainly by Christians until, well, by the 10th century, you have Hebrew translation of Josephus, although it's via a Christian paraphrase of Josephus. So this is the Sefer Yosipon from the 10th century onward. And this became a hugely famous work in Judaism, the Jewish circles. I speak now of Judaism because it became Judaism later on, Jewish communities that actually called what they did Judaism. From the 10th century on, the Yosipon became a very, very famous work in Jewish circles. But before Christians, so the question to ask maybe is, how did Christians come to know about Josephus? Why did they come to think he was important, an authority that they should copy? Well, because there are 2 centuries intervening between when Josephus wrote and when the Christians got hold of him. And it wasn't the Christians who made him famous in the ancient world. They preserved his writing, and he became famous in the medieval period because of the Christian interest in his works. But that really began with Origen, who we've been looking at in Contra Celsum, and Eusebius, especially Eusebius, and then Epiphanius and others. But Eusebius was the crucial guy, and Eusebius is writing in the 4th century, right? The early 300s. This is almost 2 centuries after Josephus wrote. And he makes a big deal of Josephus, and he tells us why he's using him so much. And the reason is, he says he's such a famous writer. In fact, he says there's a statue of him in Rome. He was the most famous of all the Hebrew, that is Jewish, writers, was Josephus. So I'm going to use him to show my Christian claims that the war was, God's punishment of the Jews. So he quotes extensively from Josephus's war, like big chunks of quotation from the war. But Eusebius is the first guy to do that. And he explains that he's doing it because Josephus already has a reputation as a straight shooter, as the great historian, statue of him in Rome, highly regarded. But that wasn't created by the Christians. That was created by the Romans. Now, if you want to see who else is using Josephus, for example, I mean, again, most ancient writers have gone. They're lost to us. Vast majority of ancient writing has just disappeared. But a 2nd century grammarian named Aelius Herodianus, or Herodian, uses Josephus extensively. Whenever he's talking about the East, the Middle, what we would call the Middle East, the Eastern world, for him, the Levant, Syria and Judea, he cites Josephus a couple dozen times for names, for the meanings of words. He says, go look at Josephus. So this is before Christian writers, except, I've argued that Luke Acts used Josephus. But why did Luke Acts use him? Because he was already the go-to historian for Roman Judaea. Why was he the go-to historian for Roman Judaea? Because the Flavian regime, the Romans, put his books in the library. So he was already famous from then on. So to summarize, I don't think that Christians made Josephus famous. They are responsible for preserving his writings for late antiquity and the medieval world, especially. In the Middle Ages, Josephus is, the guy. He's the big guy for Christians to be in dialogue with. But that's originally because the Roman government and Roman authorities gave him such a prominent position.
Let's take a look at the next one. Neophyte 1, thank you for your super chat. Final question, Doctor. I understand Second Temple Judaism, binitarian, and somewhat polytheistic beliefs. Was Josephus a strict monotheist or binitarian?
We have absolutely no reason, good question. We have no reason to think Josephus was anything other than a deeply committed monotheist, because he says so at every opportunity. Remember, I was talking about that unity that he portrays in the Against Apion, the unity of Judean culture and civilization, in contrast to the crazy Greek world where everybody's disagreeing and conflicting and so on. This all stems from the idea of the one God, right? And he makes that like really, really clear. Also, in the Antiquities, when he's beginning to explain Moses' laws, he says Moses didn't do what other legislators do. So the common assumption was that other legislators, lawmakers, just built on their own people's traditions and customs. So the Egyptians had their laws, the Syrians had theirs. He says that Moses differed from all of them by first contemplating nature, so that whereas every other nation just follows its local laws, the Judean laws uniquely are based on the principles of nature. And these begin with the idea of the one God. They're just philosophical reflection teaches you that there's one, one mover, one God, one super intelligence behind all of this. That's Josephus, and he says that Abraham was the first to figure this out, right? So he makes a big deal of there being one God, and he sees that as the highest level of belief among the Greek philosophers as well, right? Plato and Pythagoras before him, and the Stoics and others, that there's one ultimate source of being in the world. Yeah, so he's definitely a monotheist. I'm not sure about the whole binitarian, binitarian picture. I mean, many scholars have talked about two powers in heaven and this kind of thing. The evidence of ancient texts, also Philo, with the idea of the logos. So there's God, and then there are other kind of somehow subsidiary divine eminences or whatever they are. I'm not sure that any of that compromises monotheism ultimately, but that's for others to debate. Josephus was a monotheist, yeah.
When you look at the whole life of Josephus from what he tells us from the text that he wrote, what do you make of it?
Well, I think he was a most remarkable fellow who unfortunately has been rubbished in most of history. I mean, Christians sort of valued him, but not because he wasn't a Christian, and they knew that, and they had this problem that they leaned on him so much, but he wasn't a Christian. In the Jewish community, he did find sort of indirect value through the Sefer Yosipon in the second millennium after Christ of the Common Era. But then in the early Zionist period, he was rubbished again there was this strong impression that he was a coward or a traitor to his people because he survived the war and lived among the Romans. I think all of this, and also the modern critical view of Josephus, tended to be that he was an untrustworthy historian and even a liar, a dissembler, crooked. I think all these views are unfortunate. I find pretty much untold riches in this author. I mean, he wrote 30 volumes. This is rare. I mean, even Tacitus or Polybius, we don't have, or Livy, we don't have their complete works, right? We have a chunk of them, so we have an idea what they wrote. We don't have the works as wholes. With Josephus, we have 30 intact volumes. And like this is a gold mine of insight. And I think he's quite a profound fellow, actually. He's not a deep thinker in the philosophical sense. But so what? And he's very wise, I think, in many, many ways. So just to take one example that I think is not well known, He's somehow a political realist, what we today would call a political realist. He's clearly thought very deeply about how nations interact, what sends people to war, the fear generally out of which people act that drives them to war. How should you respond to provocations? How should you respond to a great power? We tend to simplify all of this stuff, I think, far too much. We talk about imperialism and colonialism and this and that, and these were evil and oppressive, and everybody wanted to rise up against them. The world was much more complicated than that, and always has been, I think. And Josephus is trying to navigate this whole thing. Roman power, yes, he says we've become enslaved to Roman power. The fact that he uses the language of slavery, does that mean that he wished to be free of Roman power? Did he think Judea could be an autonomous power or state of some kind? Well, no, I don't think he did. But he's thought about it a lot, and he's very sophisticated in the way that he plays around with the language of freedom and slavery. What is true freedom? The Stoics had talked a lot about this kind of thing. What is real freedom? Is it external freedom? Is it internal freedom? And Josephus navigates many kind of corners of this. He doesn't have a simple view. He's very pleased, for example, that the Hasmoneans, who were a previous generation of Jews, achieved what they did by conquering neighboring peoples. He's quite happy with that. That even at the cost of brutality and violence, they conquered neighboring peoples. He doesn't have any problem with that at all. But on the other hand, he doesn't think that applies to the present, that therefore one should rebel against Rome. That would be, in his view, foolish, because God allowed Rome to be in power right now, and Rome has actually been good for Jerusalem. So his views are really nuanced. In answer to your question, Jacob, I think he's an endlessly interesting fellow. I don't believe that even though people sometimes call me like a Josephus expert or something, I feel like I've just scratched the surface, of these 30 volumes. I've just begun to probe, and I'm constantly finding places where I think, wow, this guy, he's not superhuman. He's not a genius or anything. Well, I don't know if he's a genius or not, but he's, I'm not trying to put him on a great pedestal. I just mean he has all kinds of really interesting stuff that I think has been glossed over by our various kinds of simplifications.
What do you think of Josephus when he says that that when Alexander the Great marched into Jerusalem in the late 4th century BCE, that the high priest presented Alexander the Great with the Book of Daniel? I know that the consensus of scholars say that the Book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BCE, but could this be at all an earlier version of Daniel that was modified? And
could be, but if we frame this as a historical problem, if we say, okay, is it likely that there was an early book of Daniel then, or is this episode in Josephus easier to explain in other ways? And I think it's easier to explain in other ways. That is, it's a legend. Didn't happen. The reason I say that is that there are very many similar legends in Josephus' works, and we don't try to find historical explanations of them. For example, Moses becoming a kind of general in the Egyptian army and defeating the Ethiopians. Well, how on earth would anyone know that? It's not in the Bible, so it's clearly a legend that has grown up in the retelling. And there are all kinds of, scores, hundreds, thousands of such legends, which you'll find eventually in rabbinic literature, in the Haggadah, finding a home there. A guy named Ginsburg wrote whole volumes of the legends of the Jews, things that talk about the biblical period, and that would include Alexander, the late biblical period, that were not in the original text but surfaced many centuries later. These are most easily explained as legends, in the same way that the stories of Jesus that turn up only in the 3rd and 4th centuries are most easily explained as legends, not as something we need to find actually happening. Yeah, the book of Daniel, there's good reason to think that it was completed in 160s BCE. So there's also good reason to think that earlier traditions in Daniel were much earlier, for sure, from the 4th, 5th century maybe. Yes. But to think of an actual book of Daniel, that's not what Josephus is talking about. Josephus thinks that the book of Daniel was written, the whole thing was written back in the Babylonian Persian period, the transition from Babylonian to Persian rule. That's when he thinks the book was written, around 500 BCE. He's sure of it. That's why he celebrates Daniel as such a great prophet, because he says, look, he predicted clearly, naming people almost, sometimes naming, sometimes making it very clear who he's talking about, all the way down to Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king. And he says, it's amazing. I mean, how can you explain that except that he was the greatest prophet? So when he goes on to say in the next volume that Alexander visited and was given this book, that's the book he's talking about, not some imagined earlier book of Daniel.
Let's take a look at the super chat. Renzo Rodriguez again. Thank you for your super chat. What do we know were Josephus's sources? Why do you discard Luke Acts using a common source?
Yeah, we know a fair bit about Josephus's sources. Nicholas of Damascus was a major source for the early period. And then he mentions, as in war, he doesn't name any sources at all. In antiquities, however, even when he's retelling some of the same stuff, like the Herodian history, he names quite a few sources. He cites Strabo, the geographer. He cites Livy. He cites Polybius. He cites various people. So, yeah, we know some of his sources. Then he cites documents later on, some of which at least turn out to look like they are authentic, Roman edicts and things like that. So we know a fair bit about his sources. Of course, in the biblical paraphrase, Antiquities 1 to 11, he's paraphrasing the Bible. And then in Antiquities 12 to 13, he paraphrases First Maccabees. So we have some idea of his sources, where he either he names them, or we have the text like First Maccabees, and we can compare it with Josephus in columns, and you can see that he's paraphrasing First Maccabees. There's no doubt about that. The letter of Aristeas is another text. When he talks about the translation of the Septuagint, he's paraphrasing the letter of Aristeas. By the same token, we can just compare the two texts because we have the letter, so-called letter of Aristeas. So that's kind of what we have an idea about Josephus' sources. The problem with sources is it used to be thought, and a few scholars still think, that even when Josephus doesn't mention sources, we have the brilliance to kind of reconstruct them because of the hypothesis that he just kind of slavishly followed his sources. So a number of scholars from 1870 to 1920 in particular thought that they could actually pull out Josephus' sources because all he did was sew them together, right? But we now know that he didn't work like that. He wasn't an anthologist. He was a writer. So he used many sources that we don't know about, but he completely reworked them to serve his own ends. So Josephus sources. Why do I discard the idea of common sources for Josephus and Luke Acts? I don't discard it. I just ask the question as an open question: how do you explain the parallels? The idea of common sources is the standard view. Okay, so that's fair enough. If you want to believe that, you can. What I have argued is, if that's the case, A, what were those sources? And here's a problem, that scholars don't take the trouble ever to explain what those sources look like. It turns out that those sources must look very much like Josephus. And so then you have the question, is it more efficient to think that there were sources that look just like Josephus, or to think this was Josephus? Now, that question can be answered fairly forcefully, I think. Namely, there are features, as I tried briefly to suggest before, of the shared material that are formulated in Josephus's distinctive language, right? If you want to posit that a source already did what Josephus was doing, then you're multiplying entities. This violates the principle of economy, right? Occam's razor. You're saying that there were basically two Josephuses. What do I mean by that? Well, it's a bit complicated. Let me try to take an example that that I think I can clearly state. How many Jewish schools were there in antiquity? Jacob, can I put you on the spot and ask you
Sure.
that question?
Well, on the top of my head, I don't think I remember right now. I mean, I know that Josephus talked about the main sects, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes.
Well, that's
But
it.
there were
That's it.
also
Right? That's it right there. Right there. So most scholars have said there were three main schools in antiquity, and this has been actually really important in scholarship. So, like identifying texts: is this a Pharisaic text, a Sadducean text, or an Essene text? When the scrolls were discovered, one of the main reasons they were first identified with the Essenes was because they don't talk about Essenes, and the Essene texts don't talk about Qumran or scrolls. So why would you identify them? Well, process of elimination. They're not Sadducean. Some people thought they were, but once that was excluded, are they Pharisaic? Some people thought they were at first, or at least a couple of them were. One of the first texts found was not found at Qumran, was found in the Cairo Geniza, the Damascus Covenant. Fragments of it were found much earlier in the Cairo Geniza, and some people thought it was Pharisaic. But then it turned up in fuller manuscripts at Qumran. And then it became part of the whole question of what are the Qumran scrolls? Well, you've got three schools. It's not Sadducean, it's not Pharisaic. Hey, looks like it's Essene. And sure enough, few correspondences with the Essene text sealed the deal for many people. So the idea that there were three schools has become part of scholarly mentality. But why do we think there were three schools? It's only Josephus who says that. Josephus uses this language about three, and he uses in his literary construction, he comes up with the idea, he's all about philosophy and talking about the great philosophy of Moses. He writes as somebody portraying the philosophical depths of Moses' laws. He says there were three philosophical schools. Okay, now let's take that as a working hypothesis and say, let's suppose there were three schools, and let's run that hypothesis through the evidence. Okay, there are lots of other authors who talk about Essenes, lots of other authors who talk about Pharisees and Sadducees. If everybody knew there were three schools, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, then why is it that nobody else And I mean, there are quite a few other authors. We don't have this rare luxury with most questions, but we have the largely independent texts of Mark, John, Matthew, Luke, Acts. Let's hypothesize it's independent for a second. Early rabbinic literature talks about Pharisaioi or Parushim, Tzadukim, Pharisees and Sadducees. Pliny the Elder talks about the Essenes. Philo of Alexandria talks about Essenes. People using Philo talk about Essenes. None of these authors knows anything about the Essenes or the Pharisees and Sadducees belonging to a three-school grid, a triad of schools. So if you hypothesize, yeah, but everybody knew there were three schools, then you have a problem. You have lots of unexplained evidence. Why is it that nobody else said that? If, on the other hand, you hypothesize, well, nobody else knew there were three schools. People knew about Pharisees and their conflicts with Sadducees, yes. That's well attested. That's in all the Gospels, almost all the Gospels, not in John. And it's in early rabbinic literature, and in Josephus as well. So that would make sense. And people knew about the Essenes, like Pliny, Philo, later writers like Porphyry, knew about the Essenes, but never knew they were in a group or in a grid to be compared with Pharisees and Sadducees. Only Josephus does this. Only Josephus constructs them in this language. They are the three traditional schools, right? So I know I'm going on a bit here, but my point is that's one example of many examples. Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene. Why does Luke Acts mention him? Why does Luke Acts mention Judas the Galilean? Someone else would have had to construct the world just as Josephus does in his distinctive language. Language is not free-floating. It's not neutral, right? Nobody else who talks about the Essenes calls them a hieresis, or who talks about the Pharisees and Sadducees calls them a hieresis. Josephus does that because hieresis is one word for a philosophical school, and it fits his portrayal to do that. So if you read Luke Acts and you find Josephus's literary traits, his distinctive hallmark, imprint on these texts, and you find that in Luke Acts, you have only two options. Either there was another source that did exactly the same thing as Josephus and used his creative, distinctive language, which Luke Acts took from, and Josephus took from, so he's not even original, he just borrowed it all, or Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus. The simpler of those two hypotheses is that Luke Acts used Josephus. So I'm not discarding the idea of common sources. I'm a historian. I simply conduct investigations, and then I ask which hypothesis has the greater explanatory power, right? And the hypothesis here with the greater explanatory power, if you're really interested, you can read a recent article. It's not published yet. It's coming out in a volume edited by John Kloppenborg and Jos Verheyen out of Leuven in Belgium. When that volume appears, I have a chapter arguing this much more closely for a number of cases and showing why this is a preferable hypothesis to the common source hypothesis, right? That doesn't mean I know it for sure. We know very few things for sure. I don't discard the idea. I take it very seriously, the idea of common sources. The problem is no one ever described what those sources were like. Contrast this with the Q hypothesis, right? So many of your readers, your viewers will know about the Q hypothesis. So it's hypothesized as the common source behind Matthew and Luke. The reason that's hypothesized is people tried to look at, well, what if Luke used Matthew? Very hard to understand. What if Matthew used Luke? Very hard to understand. Much easier to understand if they're drawing on a common source. But that's not the end of it. Then scholars scratch their heads trying to reconstruct what Q looked like. And lots of people have done this. There are lots of versions of Q, hypothesized versions of Q around, right? Scholars take their job seriously. They say, okay, we've considered thoroughly the idea that Luke used Matthew. We've considered the reverse, and there are all these obstacles that would be unexplained in that case. I must stress there is a significant body of scholarship who actually does think that Luke used Matthew now, but still the majority thinks not, and therefore they exercise themselves, as they should, in showing us what Q would have looked like, and then we can say, okay, so if that was Q, let's run that through and see, does that make sense of how Matthew used it? Yes. Does that make sense of how Luke used it? Yeah, okay. So let's say, for argument's sake, nobody's ever tried anything remotely like that with Josephus and Lukács. Never, ever. They have never said, well, this was what the sources looked like. Why? Because I think they would end up with Josephus. They would end up with a source that's indistinguishable from Josephus. So I hope that answers the question. I have not discarded the two-source hypothesis for Lukács and Josephus. I just don't think it explains the evidence very well.
Let's take a look at this super chat. Christian Michael, thank you for your super chat. In Contra Kelsum, Origen seems to be correcting Josephus, whereas he, Josephus, ought to have said that the conspiracy against Jesus. Thoughts?
Yeah. So I tried to suggest before when we looked at Contra Kelsum 147. Yeah, he's not. It's tricky. You're suggesting he is seeming to correct Josephus. I would say he's doing something slightly different and a little bit more devious. He's claiming that this is what Josephus said. Right? He's not saying Josephus was wrong and I'm correcting him. He's giving the impression that Josephus himself already said the destruction of the temple was due to Ananus II's execution of James. And Origen thinks he would have better said it was due to the execution of Jesus. But, he didn't. So I've already tried to explain that I think what he's done there is taken something that Origen actually said, Josephus actually said, which is that the malfeasance of the high priests was leading to the destruction of the temple, all of their nefarious acts, and he has zeroed in on this one execution of James among the other enemies of Ananus II. So I don't think he's claiming to correct Josephus. I think he's claiming something that he's claiming that Josephus supports him in a certain way, and Josephus doesn't. Right? He's claiming something in Josephus that isn't there actually.
How do you think Josephus might have died? I know that we don't really have a definitive answer to that question at this time.
Wow, that's not a bad question. I've wondered about it myself, but we have absolutely no idea. We don't even know when he died. He had to have died after about 100, just because he dates the Antiquities to 93, 94. And then came the autobiography, and then came the book we call Against Appian on the Antiquity of the Jews, which is already responding to responses to the Antiquities. So there has to have been a few years in there. But that's all we can say. He may have lived until 110, 120. He was born in 37. And, people talk about ancient life expectancy as being very short. That's misleading. Plenty of people, if they survived infancy and then survived their teen years, there were people who lived till, in fact, famous people lived till their 70s and 80s. No reason why not. Vespasian, Corbulo, even some top commanders and generals, Cestius Gallus, who was the legate of Syria. He seems to have been about 70 when he was functioning as legate, and the great Corbulo was close to 70. So people did live till their 80s and 90s. There are even ancient works called On the Long-Lived or Long-Lived people who lived past 80 or past 100. So Josephus may have lived until 110 or 120. We just have absolutely no idea. And therefore, we have zero idea of how he died. The possibilities are many.
Final question for the stream.
Do you have an idea, Jacob? Did you have a proposal about that
Well,
caused you to ask the
what
question?
I was going to ask is, I wonder. Now I know Arthurian legend is very, very late, 1,000 years later, but and then there's a character called, I think he's called Josephus of Arimathea, and he travels to Britain. It seems to be implying that he's fleeing. I think it's implying he's fleeing the Emperor Domitian's persecution of philosophers and Christians, among other things.
Yeah.
Is it possible that Josephus might have fled somewhere because of what was going on with Domitian?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, these are tantalizing possibilities. Like, for example, his Antiquities comes out just at the height of Domitian's harsh measures against Jews and against those who are Judaizing. And Josephus's Antiquities could be read, in fact, I think is easy to read, as a work that encourages Judaizing, becoming a Jew. I mean, the last volume, volume 20 of the Antiquities, has a big section from 2017 to 96 is devoted to the conversion of the royal house of Adiabene. When this royal family from Iraq adopts Judean law and abandons their native tradition and accepts, Judean customs and law as their own. They become like Judean citizens and become very influential in Jerusalem. In fact, they built palaces and they were buried there. You can still see the Tomb of the Kings northeast of Jerusalem, where Queen Helena and her family were buried. So this work could definitely be read as encouraging, since these are Josephus is saying these are the finest laws ever created, as encouraging conversion or adoption of Judean law. And it came out just at the height of Domitian's persecution. So, one could imagine the possibility that Josephus was accused somehow of, doing something the Roman government didn't want under Domitian. But there's just no evidence of it. I mean, it's a possibility. He might also have gotten a bad case of the flu and died, or some terrible disease. We just don't know. Other indications, like in his autobiography, which came out, just after this, he says that Domitian added to his benefits after he lists benefits he received from Vespasian and Titus, and then Vespasian's other son, Domitian, added to his benefits. So there doesn't seem to be any big issue there. And then he even praises Domitian's wife for also supporting him, which could mean that Domitian died, and then after his assassination in 96, that she still continued the benefactions. Don't know, but there's nothing. So there's nothing clear that would suggest he had he ran into trouble with Domitian, as tempting as the idea is.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Steve Mason.
Hey, my pleasure.
And I thank everybody that super chatted their questions. It helps me continue the work that I do on this channel. And I thank everybody else for their participation in the live chat.
Okay.
Thanks again, Steve.
Yeah, my pleasure. How do you think it went? Was it okay? Was it clear enough?
Yeah, I think it went pretty well. Let me play the outro real quick, and then we'll talk privately for a moment.
Go ahead.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.